Forsaken Fantastic, Tales of the Future by David Rose. An investigation on Ceres. John Braden looked over the report one more time. Not much to go off, just a grieving family's request, photos of a drilled-out tunnel, half a page about the miner's gruesome death, and a copy of Dobshire Drilling's peculiar denial to launch their own investigation. He squinted as orange lights flashed overhead, signifying their ship's entry into Ceres' freezing exosphere, and the first foreign planet he'd be stepping foot on. "We'll be able to breathe?" he asked again. Sisyphus Rock, known as Fuss to those in the dank, low-paying world of the private eye, or to Braden as simply as booze-guzzling boss, peeked out from under his derby to mutter once more they'd be fine. They both needed this money. Fuss more than needed it. This investigation was the only thing keeping this business from going under. Again. It was true they both needed cash, but Braden also needed some reassurance. Was being in an interstellar fish tank actually sane? "Yeah," Fuss said, belched, rising in his seat and adjusting his hat. "We'll be fine. They'll have gravity set to Earth and air cleaner than what we were breathing back in Florida. You just hang by me." Braden nodded. It was good to hear these things. While Fuss had been on more asteroids and planets than most heroes in the sci-fi movies Braden used to love, John Braden, clutching a seatbelt as they made their descent, could only admit how incredibly out of place he felt. By all accounts, Sisyphus Rock had once been a top-notch sleuth, but his wet vice had sent him spiraling down into a hole that he hadn't just not climbed out of, but apparently had made a home there. Nevertheless, Fuss owned the private investigation company, Rock and Associates, a source of pejorative mirth among fellow PIs. They whispered the only associates were the opportunistic urchins who conjured up from alleys and flophouses intel so useless that Rock was a metaphor for how well Fuss's leads usually floated. And perhaps, by some form of ironic grace, this was why Braden had been hired. 1 minute. 1 minute, a robotic voice said over the intercom. Landing on Ceres Platform A in 1 minute. Many years ago, Braden had been cryogenically frozen, a decision he had grown to question. He had baffled his father when he gave up wealth and affluence after a sandaled pilgrimage to his third and final ayahuasca ceremony. That had been it. The world of cannibal materialism could rust and topple into the sea. He had seen the way the technomats had lived, a world being ever populated by more coders and 200 circles around the sun would just have to land him in a world better to his fitting. He had clung to this belief when, in 2024, along with a slew of others for the purpose of science, willingly vanished in their own time to experience the supposed bliss of a future advanced society. But, with the eroding beaches and corporate villainy, 2194 AD appeared dismally similar to the last day these adventurers had stepped naked into their awaiting chamber. Jobless, virtually unskilled, handed back clothing from almost 2 centuries past, he had been thawed out to bounce from one "no thank you" to the next until, after having abandoned all hope, Braden landed a position as Rock and Associates' one and only junior investigator. More a coffee maker and runner to the store for more beer, his role was dubious, but he'd convinced himself he'd learned a thing or two, and at least it kept him off the street. The spacecraft landed with a hard jolt, and they unbuckled. "Come on," Fuss said, grabbing his briefcase. When the door opened, they weren't greeted by Dobshire miners or steely-eyed superintendents as Braden had half expected. At least the airlock worked. As the two walked down the steps and began making their way through the oppressive tube, its glass, patched and glued as it was all that separated them from a sky so starlight that night could never fit. Not as in Neolando, where what had once been Orlando's skyline now polluted a cloudy, joyless murk. Stars in this airless void burned big and bright and blue. "Just keep walking," Fuss nudged him along, appearing more interested in scratching his chin than in the enchanted oblivion that stared down on him. "So, Braden said, go over the game plan one more time?" "Sure, kid. The dead miner's family, what was his name again?" Braden flipped open his notes as they, by the grace of God, were coming to the end of the tunnel, marked by a sealed station door. Says here, wait, okay, got it. Mark Massessi. Messie's family paid us to determine cause of death. I still don't get why Dobshire just didn't do their own probe. Fuss grunted. These operations are shady as shadow, kid. Who the hell knows what really killed him? I suppose we will soon, right? If it's how that little bullshit report reads, then he was crushed by a cave-in. We confirm it, we go home. And if we don't? Fuss shouldered past him, triggering the sealed door, causing it to open in a sudden mechanic swirl. He lifted his imitation leather to reveal an archaic revolver tucked into his waistband. Then we got a private eye. Now, for all the research Braden had done on Ceres, this dwarf planet that took up more space in the asteroid belt than any other piece of clutter sure made him feel as if he'd never spent a minute preparing. Fuss had been right. They'd walked through the airlock tube no lighter or heavier than they would have back in Florida. And yes, the craggy gray surface outside looked like all the pictures. But the colony they stepped into, their home until this investigation ended, mining station DD-148, was something again that forced Braden's 21st century brain to resort to bad late-night movies. DD-148 opened up like a Wild West flick that had been rearranged by a space alien. A small, gloomy village under a giant glass dome. Sleepless robots clacked past on tracks while men, there to mine and man machinery, stood solemnly or slipped like shadows under the electric lamp's blue and evanescent green. Don't mind the miners, Fuss said, pointing to a habitation cube they were apparently destined to enter. Miners almost always suffering from seasonal affective disorder. Braden looked at the face of one such wolfman before deciding it best to stare down at his own shoes. That and they chew on a lot of psychedelics. Okay, Fuss said. This looks like her. Her, Braden soon noted, was the station's morgue. It was gray and it was ugly, and it looked like everything else. Can I help you? A large creature then said. Braden tried in vain not to stare at the man's bald head, his hunched posture, or the one bulging eye that made him look like Dr. Frankenstein's goddamn Igor. I'm Sisyphus Rock, Fuss said, shutting the door that Braden had forgotten to. This is my assistant, John Braden. We're here on behalf of... Shit. The dead miner, Braden said. Mark Massessi. I am Dougal, the mortician said, wiping his hands on his smock, mimicking Fuss's intro with a sneer. You're from the Dobshire office? Nope, Fuss said. Get out, both of you. When Fuss brandished their interstellar writ, allowing them access to the corpse on behalf of the bereaved, this Dougal character grabbed the official court document, put on a pair of glasses, and hunched even lower under an overhead light to begin scrutinizing the page. As he did, Braden took in the sterile despair. His nostrils flared. It all smelled like nail polish remover. The room was no bigger than his studio apartment, though in his earthly squalor the floor was carpeted, not the barren white of tile. His walls had a few holes, sure, but none were sealed by silver doors that shined back the hanging bulbs that flickered above them. There was a covered body on the room's one table, though its accompanied steel tray, laden with half-digested pills and tubers, spoke of a rather unmysterious overdose. Dougal snarled. You, he said, looking up at Fuss. You look like a miner your damn self, and you, boy, you can't be no older than 20. And that writ, Fuss smiled, pulling up his pants, gives us access to the body we just flew a long way to see. Do I need to get the judge on comm? Maybe some eager beaver press? The mortician shook his head, freeing a humongous diamond at the end of an otherwise shoestring necklace before hastily stuffing it back behind his smock. Here, he grunted, handing Fuss the paper and stepping aside. A moment more and they were alone, under the flickering lights, free to open cubbies and scrutinize toe tags. Here he is, Braden soon cried, pulling out the sliding platform that held their man. It had taken a week to shoot from a Florida tarmac to Ceres Platform A, and prior, it had taken close to 2 for word to reach the family who'd scraped their pennies together to help Fuss get their writ signed. The body had withered. Didn't pump 'em with the goods, Fuss noted, scribbling in his pad. Odd. Braden was too focused on the corpse to say anything. Their man had certainly been crushed. Skin as white as gravestones still held the scrapes of fallen rock, the ends of the snapped bone that protruded and the obliterated ones that didn't. The face was so ghastly Braden ran for the sink.